My name is Pallavi Nuka. I'm the Associate Director of the Julis Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. Thank you for joining us today for the first panel of our symposium about ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance and sustainability. So today's panel, we have several corporate leaders who are going to talk a little bit about their company's practices. And the panel is going to be—
Yes, I am here.
The panel is going to be moderated by Dickson Bowman, who's an undergraduate, a sophomore here at Princeton University. Before I hand it over to Dickson, just a couple of housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded. We ask that you keep your microphones muted until the Q&A section. And then we also want to know that if you have questions, please use the chat button or the chat box to enter any questions. We're going to have about 20-25 minutes of Q&A following the moderated conversation, and we'll get to your questions then. And during the Q&A, you can also raise your hand with any questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dickson to introduce the panelists and kick off this panel. Thank you, Dickson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We're super excited to hear from our panelists. Rich Hutchinson, who leads BCG's social impact practice globally, Michael Goltzman, Coca-Cola's Vice President of Global Public Policy, Environmental Sustainability and Social Impact, and Tori Kaplan, the Head of Corporate Responsibility at Truist. I think that being said, let's hop in and hear what they have to say. I think one of what makes ESG so interesting is that it covers such an incredible array of issues and can mean so many different things to so many different people. So I'd love to hear what ESG means to each one of you guys in your context. If Michael, if you don't mind starting, I'd love to hear what it means to you at Coca-Cola.
Sure. First, thank you to Princeton and the center, and great to be with my colleagues and with you, Dickson, this morning. I wanted to. We should only give the. I'm hearing. Okay. I think an interesting place to start is to really think about ESG as an opportunity to both grow your business and mitigate risks. And so for us, the place that we start is really looking at our enterprise risk management framework that we have inside the company, and what are those issues that have the potential to actually generate growth or create the biggest disruptions in our business today and going forward. And then we map that against similar opinions from external stakeholders, right? Across a spectrum of stakeholders, from NGOs to government leaders, to academics, to communities, to suppliers, to our customers, to our own employees. And that really gives us what we would call our priority issues matrix. And it helps us determine really where do we want to focus. You know, there are lots of credible issues that need attention from the corporate sector out there today, but what are the ones that are most relevant to the Coca-Cola company and how we operate? Because the whole point is that if you're investing in those strategies and you're putting investment and dollars against certain things, then you're mitigating risk and you're increasing your ability to grow. And so for Coca-Cola, that means that we've put a lot of focus on things like access to clean water and water stewardship, because right, we can't make any of our beverages without access to water, right? So both for our own business, but then also for our supply chain in the communities which we operate in, water is critical for everyone on the planet and for all the ecosystems that we operate in. And so for us, that's a key priority that we selected because it has that intersection. Similarly, a lot of our beverages are sold in a package, right? We do have a lot of dispensed beverages or fountain, but a lot is sold in a package. And so when you think about, the ability to create and invest in creating a circular economy, that's also a key area where we've chosen to focus. I think, we've also, there are a number of other ones that we publish every time we put our business and ESG report out, what the priority issues matrix looks like. And we regularly update that based on both our own internal subject matter experts, but again, using feedback from a spectrum of external stakeholders. So maybe that's where I'd start today.
Rich, if we could hear from you as well.
Great, and thanks, Dickson. And Pallavi, it's great to be with you all and with everyone at Princeton, and great to be with you, Michael and Tori as well. So look, I think BCG is a privately owned partnership. And so for us, ESG is probably a little bit less about some of, I think with some of our clients, it can be about the reporting and how you work and a little bit more technical. For us, I think at a really deep level, it's just about how we help make a positive difference in the world and how we help our clients do that. And we really do think about it on two different dimensions. I think from the internal side, of course, we want to do the things that would fit within an ESG framework to be positive contributors. And so on the people side, we want to be a place that's inclusive and that can help people of all diversities and genders really come and have opportunity and grow and develop. And we have really strong commitments that we've made in the last years around climate and the environment, and committing to net zero and plans. For example, you all know with consulting, we travel a fair amount thinking about how we can actually do more of this to reduce our footprint on the world. And also, for example, partner with some of our airline clients on how they would think about moving towards sustainable aviation fuels and things like that over time. So one part of our efforts are really around the internal and how we manage our operations and what we do with that. But I think the far bigger part, and this is what Michael was talking about, is around growth. And honestly, we see ESG, or climate sustainability and social impact, as one of the two biggest waves that's going through business right now, the other being digital and technology. And so, with all of our clients, we serve, mostly large private sector companies, but we also serve governments, and we have some partnerships with nonprofit organizations. And if you said, how has our view on social impact or ESG evolved over time? When I started at BCG, we thought of it as, sort of a percentage of our time that we would do in pro bono efforts at the local community. And then, a number of years ago, we said, well, look, the real difference we make in the world is we advise and consult and can help people improve how they're effective in the world. So let's partner with some of the world's largest organizations in NGOs, people like Teach for All or the World Wildlife Fund or the Gates Organization, to help them make a difference in the world. But again, that was sort of bounded, if you will, we were doing it pro bono, so we could put a portion of what we did to it. And then what we've seen is this is something that now is incredibly important to almost every private sector organization that we work in, whether it's a bank or consumer goods company or somebody in airlines or industrial goods, et cetera. And so we've now, in the last 5 years, this has become one of the largest parts of our business. It is actually the fastest growing practice that we have at BCG to help clients on their climate and sustainability and ESG goals, and to create the plans on how they're going to make a difference in the world, how they're going to make build new businesses that are valuable, and the rest. And so that has literally gone for us being about 3% of the work that we did, several years ago, to more than 10% of our business overall today. And it's something that we think is going to continue growing as the most rapid growth part of our business.
And Tori, we'd love to hear about ESG practices at Truist as well.
Sure, thank you. And echoing thanks as well for the opportunity to talk with you all today and be with the panel here. So first, let me just say that Truist is the 7th largest commercial bank in the United States. It is largely in the Southeast and slightly into the Mid-Atlantic, and really looks at ESG through our purpose, first and foremost. And so the Truist purpose is to inspire and build better lives and communities. And so we really use that as our North Star to connect every other aspect of ESG to that. And so when you pull back from that and say, well, what does that mean relative to ESG? It means a lot of things. And so for a financial services institution, where we think we can help is partnership and using some of the other terms that others have raised, collective impact. And so when we're talking with clients about their aspirations relative to climate change and the journey we're all on to make positive strides there, our work is really about helping to first understand their work, where are their aspirations, and what is our role in helping them achieve them, whether that's through capital, access to finance, or understanding those innovative and new opportunities where their efforts to decarbonize actually help our efforts collectively when you look at where the financial services institutions are going relative to the E of ESG. On the social front, banks have been in the social part of that sort of acronym for a long time through CRA efforts, and lots of work there being done on very pressing issues in our nation and globally on affordable housing, again, access to finance, and finding new ways and new means for folks to connect to those opportunities, and also really leverage our sort of best foot forward in terms of community support. And so when we exercise the S of ESG, we are out in community every day, looking not only through the philanthropic side and how we leverage the opportunities we have to express that, but how do we connect that to our business objectives and helping folks reach their financial goals and financial well-being, and this notion of financial inclusion, which is both, I think, for the consumer, but also for small businesses, and looking at new ways and new opportunities through the ESG lens to help our clients and the larger society have access to the things they need to be successful. And then lastly, on the governance piece, banks have a lot of regulators in their world, and looking not only at how do we govern ourselves and how do we connect this work through the respective parts of the organization, so that we make sure that when we say something out loud in the form of ESG disclosure or in a report, that our leadership knows about it, that our board understands what that means, and that overarchingly we're connected with our regulators who have an ongoing opportunity to understand where we are in the ESG journey. And so governance is a really big piece of that, because it also helps to put those guardrails on something that Michael said up front, which is this sort of the blended need for the risk side and the opportunity side. And so those things go hand in hand when we're talking about ESG pretty much at any one of our institutions. But in banking, it really is the barometer around which our governance practices are built.
Michael, you mentioned that Coca-Cola has been very successful initially with your ESG practices and goals. So how do you continue to iterate and innovate in order to achieve your sustainability goals going forward?
Well, if you're focused on those key priority issue areas, then you're going to have some consistency in what your investment areas are. And so, for example, I mentioned water before, and we have more than a decade of real track record and investment in promoting water stewardship. Last year we celebrated having reached more than 13 million people in helping to improve access to clean water and sanitation over the last decade, and replenishing more than 170% of the water used to manufacture our beverages in 2020. We're on the verge of publishing our next business and ESG report next month. And we're in this new decade and have set then more ambitious goals to build on what we've done thus far. To date, our replenishment efforts, we're seeking to return to communities and nature an equal quantity of water that we use to manufacture our beverages, but this didn't include the water embedded in the value chain or the supply chain, right? So as we look to 2030, we're really focusing on doubling down in the places that matter most, both for our business in terms of the scarcity challenges, in terms of our supply chain, in terms of meaning working with our suppliers who use water, and how that water is used in the agricultural ingredients that we then buy to put into our beverages, and with our communities, because community access to clean water and the availability and the work to address scarcity issues continues to be a core challenge. And we know with climate change that those challenges are only going to increase. So, I think that there's the innovation is based on really constantly reevaluating what science and what expectations from both stakeholders across the spectrum, but also, what the reality of the current operating environment really means, and making sure that your current strategies are responding and creating that resilience in your own business and a resilience in the communities that we operate. And for us, that's very important, right? We are a business that is local everywhere we operate, right? We're not shipping Coca-Cola beverages, whether those are juices or waters or coffees or dairy around the world. We're actually, producing those beverages in each market with local employees using local ingredients and local distribution systems. So we have a long history of supporting, communities and how they address those key challenges. And we've seen over the last 136 years, our business grow as those communities develop. So we know that it's in our interest to help support that development and invest in those areas where we have the biggest opportunity, as Tori mentioned, to actually make an impact, both for our own business, but also for the broader community.
As a consumer-facing company, how do you deal with the inconsistency in metrics used to measure ESG performance?
Look, this is a great question, and it's a big challenge for all companies today. What I would say is, we're kind of in a watershed moment now, right? If we sort of think back, when we look at corporate performance in the financial metrics area, everyone is agreed on what are the right metrics you should look at to actually measure corporate performance. They're agreed on the methodologies for how you calculate those metrics, and they're all agreed on what are the appropriate audit procedures to be performed for third parties to validate then those numbers that companies put into the market. When it comes to non-financial metrics, so the metrics that we use for ESG, nobody's really agreed on any of that. There are a lot of different frameworks out there for which are the right metrics that companies should be reporting on. There are different methodologies, and we're at this moment. So certainly for companies, we would love to see convergence in how those metrics, right? Because you become very challenged in what is the data that actually stakeholders want to see, and that it's important that if different stakeholders are going to actually use that data, well, there needs to be some comparability between companies, right? If you're putting out data, but your peer companies are putting out slightly different data, then it's hard for anyone to actually compare the performance and use that data for something meaningful. So I would say at the moment, it's a big challenge for companies. And for us, what that means is when we put out our business and ESG report on an annual basis, we need to do that taking into consideration a number of the different reporting frameworks, whether that's the Global Reporting Initiative or the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board or the UN Sustainable Development Goals or any of the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures. All of that comes in, but it means that we're juggling some of those different metrics, and we all know that there's new rules coming out both in the United States and in Europe, over the coming period. So that it is a very complex area, but I know in general, I think corporations would welcome a greater convergence and alignment on metrics, because there's a huge cost in terms of what it really costs companies to do the reporting that's required. And that's, I'm sure Rich can talk more about that, but that's been a huge increase over the last period, and it's only getting more complicated. And, you know, we do things like assurance, which is having our actual auditor, Ernst & Young, do a level of third-party validation of a select group of the metrics that we publish on an annual basis. But as you do more and more of that, right, the scope for that expands, and the implications, both in terms of financial and people resources to actually produce all of that data, are increasingly significant.
Rich, yeah, if you could speak a little bit more to that, I think that would be really interesting.
So look, I'm very highly aligned with where Michael is. I mean, I think the truth is this is a place where I think the first part of it is there's actually been there's a really good part of it, which is how much investors care, how much employees care, how much governments and regulators care. All of that has gone up enormously, which is why actually companies are paying attention to this. And I may come back to that in a second. But then I couldn't agree more with what Michael was saying is, along with all of that has come really this proliferation of standards that are out there. And so, you know, even though we're a private company, we want to be transparent. And so the number of these different things that, you know, between me and our CFO that we get, you know, we have to decide which ones to respond to, how to do it. And it's hard. And I think our sense is that there will be more and more convergence on that, probably not perfect, but more and more convergence on that over the next 2 to 5 years. I would hope faster rather than slower, but that may be more hope than, than reality. And then the other thing I would say is we are seeing, you know, the private sector and businesses take an increasingly active role through ecosystems and collaboration, and playing a role in shaping those standards or in shaping the playing field and the policy that governments are putting forward. And I actually think that's a really positive development, because it's interesting. At COP26 this year, I think many people who'd been sort of seeing that for a number of years reflected that it was the first time that private sector and businesses were often out in front and pushing harder and further on the governments, rather than the other way around. And so I think there's a big role for the private sector and businesses to play in forcing that consolidation, demanding it, because I think the world has now said, this is what we want, but we need to get it to a place where we can do it in a level playing field and in an efficient way that gets us where we want to go.
Have you seen that collaboration has become a big trend in improving ESG practices?
Yeah, so let me maybe say 2 things that I've seen over the past few years. The first is, I just want to go back to this general point on the environment, which is, if you go back 5 years, when we looked at analysis on, you know, were companies that were great on ESG getting significant premiums in the marketplace, or how many investors were actually really talking about ESG and focusing on that, the data was noisy and not so clear. There are now a whole bunch of sectors where it's really clear that you get valuation premiums based on ESG performance, and the amount of funds that are there, you know, that are focused that way are just much higher. So investors, you know, whenever I talk to senior executives, it's pretty clear that their investors care about this. You all on this call, like employees, if I think about BCG, our employees are so mission purpose driven that if we weren't focused on this, like, I honestly think our ability to attract talent would be vastly less than it is today. Our clients, as I said, are all taking it on. And so what does that mean? It means this has gone from something that sort of is on the side of the plate, you know, that you might sort of do with some portion of your time because you wanted to do it, to something that's actually really core and at the heart of sort of competitive advantage, I think, for most companies. And that's actually why people are calling us to help them on that. So that's piece number one. And that's probably that changed in the last 5 years in the environment, and thus it's gone from sort of in the top 10 of CEOs things on their list to in the top 2 or 3 is my general experience. And that is one of the things that makes me most hopeful for the world. Then the second thing is, I do think there's a lot of collaboration, especially around innovation, policy setting, and standards. So it used to be around sort of setting collective targets as an industry. It's now really moved towards how do you actually get the right policies in place, with different, and put those forward, or how do you actually get innovation to happen collectively across industries is where I see it being most effective. And we see a lot of energy and action.
How do you maintain your very well-known tenets of privacy and confidentiality if you're working with different client companies to improve their ESG practices and to take learnings from one situation and apply them to one another?
So I guess I would say there's a few things in there. One is we probably have, and I want to be thoughtful about how I frame this, because there are areas of this that are absolutely strategic for our clients where they are trying to do things that are unique to them. And this is actually part of how they improve their business and their position in the world. And with our clients, we respect those in the same way we would sort of any other intellectual property or the strategy that they have. And we, and we do that. That said, there are two things that actually make it easier for us, I think, to port best practices and learnings and other types of things across on this. One is we invest with our clients on this together. So we don't actually think about, always the same price points for this type of work as we do our normal work. And part of what goes with that is because we're trying to do something collectively good in the world, we ask for a bit more freedom to share key things across and ideas. Obviously, again, not the strategic parts and the competitive parts that are there specifically, but more of the general knowledge and how to and the rest. And then the second is those ecosystem partnerships. We are finding many more companies wanting to work together. And so the role that we can play in helping companies link across industries to solve some of these things, it's actually one of the places where clients aren't asking us to keep things quiet. They're asking us to help bridge. So that's helpful.
Tori, I kind of want to hear about Truist's sustainability finance and your social impact bond. I'd love to hear how that idea was conceived and launched and what the benefits you're seeing are. Okay,
so I'll take the first one, the concept of sustainable finance. And so we're all at an inflection point, I think, in financial services and sort of looking at, if we're skating on the ice rink, where is the hockey puck going in terms of sustainable finance? So when you look at that, from a broad scale, is it doing more renewable energy investing? Is it helping our clients in our consumer facing lines of business find access to putting solar panels on their roof? Is it sort of planting a tree with every loan that you make through one of our online products called Lightstream? And the answer is yes to all. And in addition, one of the interesting nuances that's not necessarily reporting and disclosure related, but complex nonetheless, is what counts and what doesn't. And so arguably, I'm sure a lot of folks on this call are very tuned into everything that's happening in the climate change space. And when you think about what does that mean for us in terms of things like financed emissions, which is the other side of sustainable finance, where you're sort of sharing out loud what your carbon intensity really looks like through the lens of your clients and the portfolios of business that you have. And so that sustainable finance lever is complex because we're all trying to sort of say out loud, what counts, what doesn't. And then if you look at what it's going to take for us all to get to well beneath 1.5 degrees globally, does decarbonization count, right? So there's a lot of noise right now where there are some that have an expectation that banks should just shut down oil and gas. And there may be some banks who have a recipe where they can see a pathway to that. But when you think about sustainable finance, does decarbonizing brownfield to greenfield count? And so some of those things are being discussed not only at Truist and sort of putting our taxonomy list together so that we can look at how do we grow as an organization within these ranks to do more, not only for our existing clients, but for new ones who are coming out with incredible innovative products across every industry line. So whether it's technology related or new ways of doing business that are really climate adaptations, how does sustainable finance fit, number one? And then as we look at how we say those things out loud, how do we share that information in a way that is sort of well regarded, again, from this multiple stakeholder list that we all maintain. And so on the social bond, we, as I mentioned at the front end of the call, we have a very strong set of work in affordable housing. And this social bond was a way for us in our early days as a new organization that was still sort of putting all the bells and whistles together on the merger and the complexities of that, to say, we'd like to offer this as a way for you to see who we are. And there's a huge need on affordable housing, and orienting the proceeds of this social bond, which was the first social bond to be launched by a regional bank, was a really important first move for Truist, so that there was one, a need that we could fulfill using a strength that we had, pulling forward our heritage organizations, and really more broadly, helping the larger marketplace know what we stand for.
I think, yeah, that was awesome to hear, Tori. I think this is to all three of you. How do you really quantify the negative impact that failure to address ESG concerns can have on your business? I think a lot of focus is paid to the positive impact, but I would love to hear how you actually quantify the negative impact.
Well, I'm happy to start. I think, look, I think Tori started to give you a little bit of a peek into how that means. And I think if you go back, there are risks for businesses here, right? We all are reducing our carbon emissions because we want to contribute to a more stable world in terms of the climate. But let's be clear, the changing climate is having an impact on our businesses today, like right now. So there is also a need. So, you heard me talk a little bit about, we know that climate change is going to affect weather patterns and rainfall patterns. And so that for Coca-Cola means that, it's important for us to continue to double down on the work we're doing on water stewardship. We certainly know that those changing weather patterns are increasing the amount of extreme weather. So there's damage that is happening to facilities, but also think about, the way that disruptions can happen for supply chains and ports, or potentially even how those weather patterns change, what commodities and crops are able to grow in certain areas. And so your investments along with your suppliers in these areas are meant not just to reduce our impact on the climate, but build resilience into both our own companies, our supply chains, and those communities. And so, for example, when you work with a supplier on, improving their water use efficiency and growing the crops, that means they use less water to grow the same crops. They generally also end up improving their productivity and the amount of efficiency of their production, but it also means that they're more resilient to droughts because they need less water to actually produce those crops. The other example I might give is that we spent much of the last decade investing in women's economic empowerment because we saw that there was an opportunity to both expand a network of distributors and retailers that were run by women and that are connected to our business, and to help empower them in terms of giving them greater economic opportunity for themselves, their families, and communities. And after doing that, over the last couple of years, we did some additional work around resilience, and we discovered that actually, what are some of the communities that are the least resilient in the wake of extreme weather events? And it turns out that women are often the least resilient. And so investing in things like women's economic empowerment that actually help women be more self-sufficient and provide for themselves and their families is also a climate resilience strategy, right? It makes them able to bounce back more quickly in the wake of an extreme weather event. And so I think all of us are absolutely looking at that. That's the key thing of what businesses are focused on, is building that own resilience into how their companies and their supply chains and communities operate.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime with a couple quick thoughts. I think for BCG particularly, look, the two most important things to us are our clients and our people. And because this is so important to both, I think honestly, the risk for us is that we would not get great talent, or we would not be actually serving our clients on the issues that matter most to them if we weren't really, really focused on this. So I think we actually have a very clear view that this is at the heart of what we need to be doing. And it's really strategic on sort of the core drivers of our business. The one other thing I would say, just one very pragmatic thing we tell almost all of our clients these days is, if you're thinking about capital investments going forward and you're not pricing in the likelihood that there will be carbon prices or some sort of cost to carbon in the future, you're probably doing the math on those future investments wrong. And, so I think the point that you're asking about, Dickson, of like, what's the baseline people are using or what's their set of expectations is really important. And you can't just assume that the world's going to be, that you can operate the way you did today forever. That's not the right baseline.
I almost feel like there's not much more to add here because my colleagues have done such a great job of sort of spanning the universe. But I would just echo the point of sort of most largely being left behind. And so, if we're not adapting to this work, embracing this work, and looking at it across our entire enterprise, we will be left out and we will become irrelevant. And, we won't have clients because the messages I would be sharing in forums like this will not excite you to want to become a client of our bank. And so it really does boil down to sort of evolving to where the world is going and being a part of it and embracing that. And it's, it's hard for institutions that have been around for a bit to do that. And so when you look at, again, in financial services, there are some amazing fintechs coming out almost every day. They don't have the baggage that some of our larger institutions, not just in banking, quite frankly, but across multiple sectors. So we have to work, faster, harder, and stronger to achieve that competitive advantage, to attract and retain talent, because every single day we're looking at folks that are moving around and looking at how they are reimagining their work life and their work choices. And we need to stay competitive with that. And that really gets down to, that other facet that's connected to ESG, which is how do you pay your folks? How do you provide the right benefits that are going to give them the tools they need to be successful in their pursuits? How on the community impact side do you provide the right mechanisms for them to express their philanthropy, through your company processes and their volunteerism passions that also salute the companies at the end of the day as well? And so it's really the cost of inaction is that you're not going to be your investor's choice. You're not going to get the talent, and your clients are going to go elsewhere to get their needs served. And so it's really, it is a paradigm shift. But it's also sort of, getting us all embracing that work to realize that the cost of inaction is just too huge.
And maybe if I could just build a little, I mean, it's beyond, consumers are asking for this. So as Tori mentioned, so lots of consumers across a lot of areas, and they're looking at brands about, and they're delving deeper into the data behind it. Our own customers, so retailers are also, right, they're also engaged in ESG. And so they're looking for who are their suppliers, which we are then, how they're responding to that. As Tori said, associates, right, for your own employees, this is one of the areas that actually drives the most engagement that we talk about. Employees are absolutely interested in what we're doing in communities and how we're contributing and investing in those areas. And then, obviously there's the huge stakeholder piece, right? And we are, many of us spend a lot of time engaging with stakeholders and trying to make sure that we understand those expectations and that we're really embedding that into how our strategies are brought to life, and that we're listening. That's the only way that you're really going to be able to, keep changing expectations at the center of how your strategies are implemented.
And lastly, this being a Princeton event, how do people like students drive change in this space?
I'm going to use the phrase tempered activism as a way to sort of think about how you can have a voice, and that it is a seek to understand before being understood moment in some ways, but sort of rally around the things that are important to you and find avenues where you can share them in a constructive way, and thinking about that by playing the long game. And so while it's tempting sometimes to take a need to express a short-term view, when we're talking about things as important as climate change and net zero goals, which by the way are 3 decades of work, join the cause for the long game and think about how you can work towards the solution, and practice that first versus sort of jumping immediately to activism, which sometimes for companies is a really challenging place, and thinking about those nonprofit organizations that when you have time to volunteer, serve on boards, use those as platforms to have a larger voice around the topics that you care about. Those things resonate right into the company domain, and those things shape how companies think about the work they do, in addition to the other ways that you can connect more directly. And when you go out and find employment, find the right internal business resource groups, because all of us have them around many different topics, and use that as a way to advocate for positive change.
Yeah, I was going to maybe let me see if I can say some things that are building on that a little bit, but I feel very, so first, I think activism is an important thing in helping to what I call stretch the rubber band. So I think there's an important piece of helping us see like where change needs to go and the rest of it. And I think that has a real role. I also think though, as Tori was saying, that to give you a sense just on net zero and climate, it's going to be a 30-year change that's the largest change in the global economy basically ever. It's going to be $100 to $150 trillion change. And if you think about what needs to get done, we need to transition all of the energy sources over from fossil, not all, but huge proportion of the energy sources over from fossil fuels into renewables. We need to change grids. We need to invent new storage mechanisms. We need to, completely change how all of the users of energy, whether it's vehicles and the rest of it, all of that work, that is a massive, massive, massive change. And I think there's part of what I love about what I do and the clients I work with is it's the making that change happen is really exciting. But by the way, it's also really hard, and there's real trade-offs, and it's not as easy as you might. And so I actually think one of the things I'd ask all of you to consider is, well, I think because that's such a huge economic change, there are going to be a lot of jobs in those spaces. There's going to be a lot of roles to play in almost every type of institution and how that change works, not on sort of the side part of the jobs, but in the day-to-day piece and the rest. And so I think, one of the biggest places you all can have an impact is in the employers you choose, because they are sort of purpose-driven and have those goals that you align with. But then also in the types of things that you do within those organizations, and the roles, like there's going to be plenty of work to be done.
I guess the only thing I would maybe add is that, no matter what industry you're in, innovation is a huge part of what's needed, right? We've been talking a lot about climate, but we don't have all the tools that we need, right? Like, it's not like we could just say today, well, okay, we know if we just do these things that we're going to get there. There's a huge part that we need to develop. And so, and that's the case across a lot of the different areas, right? So, I mean, innovation and, that's a key part. And so for those that are, invested in science, then there's a huge role to play. I think, for those of us who took a more liberal arts path, I think government is very important in this, right? And I think that, there's been that a lot of people are, have perhaps either given up or decided that, government can't deliver on whatever it is that people expect them to deliver on. But I increasingly say all the time that our role as private sector is to support government in that convening power, because when you think the government is the only stakeholder that can really credibly speak on behalf of the whole society, right? They won't be able to implement everything. They're going to need civil society and the private sector to do that, but they're really the only one that can sort of convene all of the stakeholders together and say, here's where we're trying to go, and boy, we need your input on what are the actual mechanisms and strategies that we think are going to be the best to help achieve those goals. And so for those of you who are more in a policy space, this is key, and there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that the policies are actually incentivizing the types of investments that we need.
Awesome. Well, I think now we want to open it up for Q&A. So we ask that you either please submit your questions in the chat or raise your virtual Zoom hand, and we'll call on you then.
So there was just a question that came in from Joe Bowman, and let me read it out on behalf of Joseph. So he says it's clear that a properly constructed ESG policy can, I think, expand shareholder value. In those occasions when shareholder interests and stakeholder interests are in tension, how do you balance these considerations, and how broadly does one appropriately define stakeholder in these matters? So I think that might be that could be all three of the panelists. I don't know who wants to start first.
I'm happy to chat on it a little bit. I think two things. I think the first thing I would say is I think the number one we see with our clients is trying to align the what's advantageous for the business. And by that, I mean really broadly speaking, because it attracts employees, because it increases your license to operate, because it helps grow new businesses, because it avoids risks. I think we've sort of talked about a bunch of the areas, but the more it's aligned with the interests of the business over the long term, that's when it scales. So the truth is, I think it's actually, you get much better rollout, much better scaling as long as those things are aligned. So we push really hard to try to make that work. And then I think the reality is you get down to a second set. If it's not going to be working and advantageous for the business, you get into some places where either it's just a bright line. And so the issue itself is so important, take things like labor practices or certain things like that, look, you're going to do, like, you could argue whether it's economically the right thing to do or not, but you're going to do the right thing. That's just like where you are and how you're going to do it. Or you get to a place where you can invest some in it, but you probably have a cap on how far you can go. And honestly, that's the era of corporate social responsibility I think we've been in for long periods of time. Or if it's just, look, the truth is there's so many topics on ESG that some of them you can't tackle everything. And so it's not on the radar screen. So anyways, I don't know if that totally answers the question, but what I see.
I'm going to pile on to that a little bit and really agree on alignment and sort of clarity over the long haul. And so I'm going to use an example to articulate the point where in recent days, there's been heavy activity on states coming out with their own sort of rules and thoughts on the financial services particularly, and what they say in their policies about their lending practices. And so on the one hand, and this really does circle back to the challenge of the multiple stakeholder wheel that we're always looking at, which is in the investor room. They want to see a policy that's very specific and really detailed in terms of how you lend and to whom and what that criteria looks like. And then in another room, say in the state of West Virginia or in some of the sort of other states that are now joining this coalition, where they're saying we will not allow, we will not have the state utilize your services if you discriminate against the fossil fuel industry, right? So think about those two things in terms of creating policy that you would publish externally around your activity. So it is a challenge where you don't want to write it for a moment. You want to write it for the long term, and you want to make sure that it's connected to your risk practices and your multiple stakeholder interests, because you can sort of run into a dangerous place pretty quickly if you're not thinking about all those things in the words you say. And there have been banks, for example, that have been shut out of the state of Texas because of their ESG policies and the things that they said. And so it's interesting to watch all of that in the context, particularly at Truist, where we're still a new organization and we're still shaping some of those policies and looking at what's happening sort of on those debates every day. So, I agree on clarity and alignment, and they shouldn't be the end all be all for everything that you do, because this world changes very frequently. And you want to also be able to be clear enough so folks understand, what you stand for and your perspectives and philosophies, but not too much that you impede yourself by virtue of having one.
Great. Thank you, Tori and Rich. So there's another question that just came in the chat from Dr. Leonard Miller. Leonard, if you're on, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Okay, so Leonard, let me just summarize Leonard's question. This is a question about whether the private sector may be, in a sense, too short-termist or driven by short-term interests, and isn't it really the role of government to set those important metrics and define the parameters by which private sector should be moving forward on this? And I know we discussed that a little bit at the beginning, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit more I don't know if Tori, you would like to say something on that, or Michael or Rich?
I'm happy to start. I think, well, I think I just previously, I think I made clear that I think there is absolutely a role for government, right? And policy has a clear place in how all of this is done. I don't think that, you know, everything necessarily can always be done totally, you know, voluntarily, but there is a role for how companies can make sure that they're lining up with the trend and the direction of things. And, you know, recently our board approved incorporating ESG metrics into executive LTI. This is aligned with our goals for 2030. So it's not a 2050 type of metric, but it is absolutely aligned with you know, our goals and on the glide path to get us to you know, those 2030 goals. So I do think that increasingly that's really the whole point of ESG, is that these are longer term targets. They're not short term, and that you need to be able to both give the companies the ability to invest to achieve that, but then incentivize how it's done as well. And I saw in the chat that, you know, I think all of us are performing our overall mapping of where our climate impacts are, so that we can act in those areas that are actually most relevant for our companies, right? It's going to be different based on the business model of each company, and certainly, right, you know, a huge amount of work being done by our company, but many of our peers and others on what would be considered scope 3. So making sure that our suppliers are taking actions and establishing their own science-based targets that will then help us achieve those broader goals. So you know, I don't think there's any one lever that is going to win out. I think frankly, we need all of them in order to, you know, these are very challenging areas to address.
I would add to that the word inclusive, again, relative to the connectivity between government and shaping policy, and how we all can play a part in advocating for balanced solutions that you know, don't lean in too far one way and exclude something else. So an example for us is really the confluence of the E and a just transition. So when you look at the S part and connectivity to that, so having a net zero goal, you know, means something. And how as you're doing the work on not only your own analysis, but how you're sort of shaping the advocacy for what's next, is how do you make sure that, you know, those efforts at the highest level don't put extra strain on the low and moderate income communities that we have, that we already know are hugely vulnerable to the physical aspects of climate change, but also the transition aspects of climate change, and the way that certain cities in America were formed, and how they how they were built, and those changes as well. So I would say that, you know, it is an inclusive effort. It's an advocacy effort. Yes, government really, you know, needs to step in and lead here, but we also have to make sure that we're sharing sort of multiple perspectives and voices that help shape that, to not be exclusive by version of trying to create rules and protocols.
Great. Thank you, Tori, and thank you, Michael. Again, for the audience who's listening in, feel free to raise your hand if you have questions, or use the chat feature. The next question is from Jack Hartman. Jack, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Okay. let me just read out Jack's question then. So given that divestment is a hot button issue these days, what is the thought process of each of your respective firms on divestment? Whether it's an appropriate strategy and how that fits into your wider ESG portfolio. And I assume, Jack, you mean fossil fuel divestment, which is being actively debated on campus now.
I'm happy to start with a few thoughts on this. And I think it's, look, I think it's a very complicated topic. And I think, by the way, you can have, certainly, I think it's very fair to actually have different points of view, because when you talk about divestment, you're talking about the ownership of companies and sort of obviously what you're supporting with your capital. And so I think it's a perfectly fair thing for an individual or an institution in some ways to say, if they want to, that they have certain types of things they'd like to direct their capital to, and that's not part of where they want to go. That said, I actually think if we come back to this idea that it's a 30-year transition, and it's something that really is going to take a long time, one of the dangers is if you decide you need or want to divest, how you divest. Because the truth is, I actually think the most important thing for me is actually that if we're going to make this transition, the owners of the assets that need to change have to be aligned with those assets changing. And you want people who really are thinking about ESG and change and reporting and transparency and all of those different types of things. And so I think you can, so for example, I know people who are taking exactly the opposite step and saying, we really want to be diving in on assets, it's the gray to green or brown to green, type of transition. And there are PE funds being raised right now to go do that. And I actually think some of that is some of the most impactful work that will be done, because it's about how you go and do it. And so to me, I'm probably a little bit less focused on what you own versus how you want to manage it and how you influence the management of it.
Maybe the only thing to build on that is, not necessarily specific to divestment, but I would just say, the whole trend and change over the last few years has been that ESG investing has moved out of the niche area, right? It's not just socially responsible investors that are asking these questions, but indeed mainstream investors that are asking companies to have discussions across their ESG portfolio and asking deeper dive questions. And to me, that's, as Rich said, that's the opportunity, because that's where you can actually help push for additional change as an investor. But of course, everyone gets to make their own choices and decisions in how they do that.
I would say the same, applies in terms of our perspectives at Truist, and that divestment isn't the first strategy. And the first strategy is partnership and understanding where, our clients are moving relative to their efforts. And while at the same time looking at with respect to our net zero goal, how are we growing to that goal by providing the right kinds of financing that will help us achieve that? And how are we partnering with clients to understand their journey, meshing that up together in some taxing math, if you will, and figuring out, okay, so if we assume X, Y, and Z over the next 10 years relative to the targets we set, can we not need to divest at all? And we, and someone said earlier, we haven't solved for all of this. And I think that's where we're seeking not to sort of divest anywhere, but first start with partnership, first start with sort of where can we be a more helpful agent of change and influence that using, our financial tools. And then, down the road, if you have clients who just sort of refuse to sort of join the effort, well, then that's a different story. Where there are some in the continuum of this work who may say we don't believe that that's the right thing to do, and then at that point, divestment may be an aspect of your business model instead of a social statement, and I think that's a really important aspect of this as well.
Great, thank you, Tori. So I think we're going to be ending at 1:20. I see one raised hand from Leslie Lai. I'm wondering, Leslie, can you unmute yourself and then maybe get in your question?
Yeah, so my name's Leslie. I'm actually an alum of Princeton. This is how I found out about the program from the policy school. I'm currently leading the social impact work in our very early stage ESG initiatives at the company. And so I was just wondering for people who are early on in their journey, companies who are early on their journeys, what would you advise them in terms of making sure it really sticks with the skeptics within the company, like who should own it, whether it's, within our investor relations team, legal, finance, like who should own it such that it really endures throughout the company's life cycle. And then just in terms of the consumer facing aspect, I know there's this, I used to work in philanthropy and nonprofit, so I know there's always this tension between, the PR branding versus what's meaningful actions being taken. Like, what's the balance between some story when you're not completely there yet, but not you just don't share anything at all. But thank you so much. This has been a great coaching session for me personally.
Right, thank you, Leslie. I think that opens up a whole other set of issues. I don't know if we'll have time to touch on that fully, but I think it's exciting to see a Princeton alum kind of working in this space and starting this company. And I don't know if any of the speakers want to touch briefly on Leslie's question.
I would just say the strategies that you implement need to be embedded in your business, right? It needs to be about making your business ready to accelerate growth or mitigate the risks that are associated with how you and your value chain conducts your business. So I just think that that's the key thing of where you want to focus.
Perfect. So in the interest of time, I'm going to let everyone go. I know students have classes coming up shortly. I want to thank all the speakers, Michael from Coca-Cola, Tori from Truist, and Rich Hutchinson from the Boston Consulting Group. And then also thank you, Dickson, for inviting this wonderful group of speakers to join us. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules. And Michael, thank you so much for bringing up the idea of government. As we are at a policy school, we're always thinking about the role of government and how public servants can contribute. So everyone, thank you for joining us. We appreciate all your input and your perspectives. The symposium continues next Thursday, a week from today at the same time, and we'll be talking more about the investor side and investor perspectives on ESG issues. So thank you again. This session is recorded and we'll make the recording available to all the participants. So have a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you.